We turn now to Aristotle. And in this lecture, we're going to have just a brief history of Aristotle's life and accomplishments. We'll look at Aristotle's philosophy and how it differs from his teacher Plato. And then we will dig a little bit into Aristotle's logic. But to start with a brief history, so Aristotle, as I've already mentioned, is a student of Plato. And Aristotle attends Plato's academy, and you might consider Aristotle to be Plato's greatest student, but he's also Plato's greatest critic. And we don't know exactly when Aristotle became a critic of Plato. Some have argued that Aristotle was a critic even before he went to the academy, and he goes to the academy just to make sure that he understands Plato well so that he can give an adequate critique of Plato. And some think that he actually went to the academy being a follower of Plato and eventually changes his mind while he's at the academy and comes up with a different approach to his understanding of philosophy, the forms. But it doesn't matter necessarily for this class. What you need to know is that Aristotle's approach to philosophy is different than Plato. And you need to also know that after Plato dies, um, you would think that Aristotle would be the one who would take over for Plato at the academy, but that's not what happens. In fact, what happens is that Plato's nephew takes over and Aristotle leaves. And we don't know exactly why Aristotle leaves. Perhaps he's jealous. Perhaps he doesn't have a lot of respect for Plato's nephew. We don't know for sure, but we know that Aristotle does become an itinerant teacher. So he teaches for a living. People would pay him money for his instruction. And he tutors a 13-year-old who, as history would continue, would become a very famous 13-year-old that we know of today as Alexander the Great. So he starts tutoring Alexander the Great at age 13, and he teaches him for a few years. Eventually, he returns to Athens. And when he returns to Athens, he does not go back to the academy, but instead starts his own institution called the Lyceum. Now, the Lyceum is very similar to the academy, but we might think of the Lyceum as being even closer to what a modern university is today. At the Lyceum, they conducted research. They started different branches of knowledge, different types of sciences. They had a library. They had teachers. And so the Lyceum was very much closer to what a modern university would be, even closer than what Plato's academy was. The accomplishments of Aristotle cannot be overstated. He formalizes logic, and in fact, his approach to logic was the standard for several hundreds of years, hundreds of thousands of years after he formalizes logic. And in fact, if you take a course in logic today at any university, you're going to get remnants of Aristotle's approach to logic. And in fact, many textbooks in logic begin with Aristotle's categorical logic. It might be an updated form of Aristotle's logic, but you start with categorical logic and then you move on to other approaches to logic, propositional logic, etc. But he formalizes logic, and at the same time, he starts various branches of science. He starts physics, zoology, botany, etc. He coins the term metaphysics. So before Aristotle, people are engaging in metaphysical questions. We saw this with the pre-Socratic philosophers, the sophists, Socrates, Plato. They're all doing metaphysics, but Aristotle coins the term. He is arguably the second most important philosopher. And when I say arguably, he's either the first or the second. Now, most people would say Plato's the first most important philosopher because he becomes before Aristotle, and he's the one that starts the academy, and Aristotle is the teacher. Well, if Plato is the first most important philosopher, it's only because he came before Aristotle. Arguably, Aristotle's accomplishments are even greater than what Plato's accomplishments were. Aristotle's followers were called peripatetics. A peripatetic is just somebody that travels somewhere. And the reason why they were called peripatetics is because Aristotle's style of teaching was to walk and instruct his students. And so when we say that Aristotle had followers, he literally had followers. He would walk along and he would teach, and his students would listen to him as he was walking and teaching. Uh, his approach to ethics has its own specific uh, branch of ethics or approach to ethics today called virtue ethics. And in fact, virtue ethics over the last several decades has been making kind of a revival in the study of ethics. It's a unique approach which we'll look at in a later lecture. But he's very influential when it comes to ethics, very influential when it comes to politics. So his accomplishments certainly cannot be overstated. So as we look at Plato's philosophy and some of his big ideas, then we're only going to be able to scratch the surface of Aristotle's thought. But I think it's helpful to compare Aristotle to Plato. And in fact, there's a long tradition of people comparing Plato and Aristotle to each other, as we see in this painting from Raphael, where Plato is pointing up, and this symbolizes that if you want to understand the nature of reality and understand the world around us, the way that you do it is you have to access the realm of the forms. And if you want to, again, understand Plato's thought, go look at those lectures that I have up on YouTube on Plato. But for Aristotle, Aristotle's different, and you see it represented in this painting where Aristotle's hand is hovering over the ground. And for Aristotle, this symbolizes that if you want to understand the world and understand reality, you don't need to access some immaterial world that Plato calls the forms. Rather, you need to look at the real world right in front of you. Aristotle's philosophy is sometimes called Hylomorphism. So Hylomorphism just comes from two Greek words, hyla, which means matter, morphe, which means form. So the two are together, matter and form go together. Matter is what something is made of, and the form is what something is made into. And so what distinguishes Aristotle from Plato is that Plato said if you want to know what reality is, you have to look up there to the separate world that Plato calls the forms. For Aristotle, the forms exist in the material things themselves. And so wherever you have matter, you necessarily have form. So Aristotle thinks that form is real. The forms are real. He just doesn't think that the forms exist somewhere else outside of the material world. Wherever you have matter, you have form, and wherever you have form, you necessarily have matter. The two cannot be separated. Now, to understand what Aristotle means by this, we can think of how we categorize objects in the world. So if we think about an oak tree again. So what makes something an oak tree? We know that oak trees go through different stages. So we can start with an acorn, and we know that an acorn eventually will turn into an oak tree. But if we're trying to understand what an oak tree is, what helps us to understand it? Is it the material substance that makes something an oak tree, or is it the form? Well, Aristotle's answer is yes. It's both of them. You have to understand the material substance of an oak tree, and you have to understand the form. Again, as with Plato, this brings together Heraclitus and Parmenides. So Heraclitus was the one that everything's always a becoming, things are always changing, where Parmenides wanted to emphasize that everything is just a being, it's just one thing. Well, what Aristotle does with this is he distinguishes between actuality and potential. So potential is where you have the forms. Now, the potential exists in the material objects themselves, but what's actual is matter and motion. So when you look at an acorn is actually an acorn, but it's in motion. It's always changing. So he agrees that things are always changing. This is what he means by actuality. But the acorn is also potentially an oak tree. So in the acorn itself, there is the potentiality for the oak tree. And so the actual and the potential come together in Aristotle's philosophy. Something is actually an oak tree, or actually an acorn, but is potentially an, an oak tree. And so that's how he brings together things being always in motion and things having sort of a pure actuality to them. This goes into his theory of causation. So Aristotle says to understand something, you have to understand different types of causes. He has 4 different types of causes to understanding the world around us. So if we want to understand, say, what a house is, well, you could look at the material cause of a house. And that's where you would look at the nuts and the bolts of the house, the sheetrock, the mud, and the tape. That's the material cause, what a house is made of. But there's also the form of the house, the formal cause. This you can see by looking at building plans. It's the shape that the house actually takes. And then you have the efficient cause, which helps us understand the house. So in this case, it would be a builder. How did the pieces arrange themselves in such a way to come into be a house? And then you have the final cause, which is the purpose of the structure of the house. And the reason that a house exists is to be a home for someone. And so if you want to understand what a thing is, you have to understand all the various causes of a house. Now we can compare this with something that exists in the real world, or the natural world, like a brain. So how do we understand a brain? Well, we could understand a brain by breaking it down to its material substances. So we can look at the material cause of a brain. And I mean, Aristotle didn't know that things broke down into atoms, protons, neutrons, electrons, but we could say things break down to protons, neutrons, electrons, or quarks, up quarks, down quarks, etc. So we can look at the material cause of the brain, and that helps us understand a little bit about what the brain is, but not a lot, because everything is made up of atoms. And so, how do we really understand what a brain is? Well, the material cause gives us some information, but not all the information that we need. We also need to know the formal cause of the brain, which is the arrangement of the brain. When we look at the neurons, the synaptic firings of the brain, the way that everything is arranged, that helps us understand what a brain is a little bit more. But if we ask the further question, how did the arrangement of the brain come to be the way that it is? Well, this is where we're getting into the efficient cause, or the mechanisms. What mechanisms brought the brain to be in its precise arrangement? Well, we could think of how we develop biologically, but we could even think of the history of development. Think about the history of human evolution. How did the brain get to be the way that it is? That is what Aristotle would consider to be the efficient cause of the brain, how the brain got to be in this precise arrangement. But then finally, we have the final cause, which is how do we understand the brain? Well, we can't really understand the brain if we don't understand that the reason why the brain exists is for the purpose of thinking. And all of these causes provide explanatory power for understanding what the brain is all about for Aristotle. And so you can't understand what things are without understanding these 4 different causes. Now, as we think about the notion of final cause, this helps us understand Aristotle's big idea, which is his idea of telos, which means purpose or end or goal. So if it's the case that the brain exists and has the arrangement that it has for the purpose of thinking, well, then that must mean that purpose is built into the system itself. At least this is how Aristotle argues. So actually everything in nature, for Aristotle, has a purpose, and it's heading towards some end. Everything in the natural world, if you want to understand it properly, you have to understand not just the material cause of things, not just the formal cause or the efficient cause, the mechanisms, but you have to understand what things exist for. What is the purpose of everything? And everything is heading towards some purpose or goal. And this is how we are to understand motion in the world. Everything in the world is moving, but they're moving to their natural end. And so there is some end that things are heading to, and at some point in this line of thought, things move to a final end. And this is what Aristotle calls the first mover. And in fact, this is sometimes referred to as Aristotle's God, the unmoved mover. Later on, when we start talking about Aquinas, Aquinas takes this idea and puts kind of a Christian theological understanding to God as the unmoved mover. But that's not exactly what Aristotle is thinking about here. Aristotle's God is a God that is not moving, it's not changing. And in fact, Aristotle's God is not causing anything to happen in nature, even though nature is moving towards a natural end. It's not that God is making this happen for Aristotle. God is actually only thinking about God, and nature is just being attracted to God, sort of indirectly being attracted to God, because for Aristotle you have pure actuality, which is what this unmoved mover is, and when you have pure actuality, that could just be thought thinking thought, because pure actuality doesn't change. Because if you think about what change is, to change means that you have potential. It means you're potentially this thing. Well, pure actuality can't change. Pure actuality just is. And so that's how Aristotle brings this notion that everything's one and combines it with his understanding that everything's always changing. As I mentioned, Aristotle formalizes logic, which today we call categorical logic to distinguish it from other approaches to logic. But his understanding of logic relates to the real world. So he has a realist perspective on truth, and all that means is when you take a statement such as, say, the statement, there is a tree outside the window. So that statement's a proposition. And a proposition is just something that's declaring something to be either true or false. Well, we might say that that statement is true, and what that means is to say that a statement is true is to say that it's correct if, in fact, it's the case that there's a tree outside the window. So if the statement lines up with reality, then the statement can be considered true. And so he's a realist when it comes to truth because he thinks that you can arrange words in such a way so that those words can correspond to the real world. And from there, he develops an approach to logic. So in his understanding of logic, logic is not simply about the abstract relationships between words, which sometimes in modern approaches to logic, logic can just be about the relationships between statements, ideas, but not necessarily relationships about things that are going on in the real world. Well, for Aristotle, logic is about objects in the real world and about the relationship between those objects. So if you can define words to particular objects, then you can see how objects relate to themselves in the real world just by understanding the relationship between the words themselves. So we could think of an example, a famous example, such as the statement, all men are mortal. Well, this is a statement not just about the relationships between words, but about the relationships between objects themselves. And how do we know that this statement is true? Well, we know it's true because of induction. We can go out into the world and we can see that all people are in fact mortal. So we have experience of that. We have experience of people dying. We have memories of it. And so deductive reasoning really is connected to inductive reasoning for Aristotle. But you could take another truth, such as, I am not my own grandfather. So this is another proposition that's asserting something. It can either be true or false. Well, how do we know that this is true? We know that that's true because of biological relationships. So the relationships between words, once we understand what those words mean, really do relate to the real world. So his realist perspective on truth also relates to grammar between sentences. And logic is a lot about just basic grammar and how grammar works. So when you construct a sentence, a proposition, you have a subject. So in this case, we have the sentence, philosophers are interested in strange topics. So what's our subject? Our subject is philosophers. So that is an object. I mean, it's a subject, but it's a relationship between something that really exists. Philosophers really do exist. I mean, you're all philosophers. We're all philosophers. And then there's a copula, which signifies the relationship between subject and predicate. So in this case, the copula is the word are, and then you have the predicate, interested in strange topics. And so this is a statement that is not just a statement about words, but it is actually a statement about something that's going on in the real world. Now, we could take the grammar of sentences and we can arrange them in different ways to make them precise and logical, and that's what logic is about, is trying to think precisely and clearly about something. And you can have what are called universal affirmative statements, such as the statement, all S are P. So all philosophers are interested in strange topics. That's a universal affirmative. But you can also have a universal negative, which is just the opposite. So no SRP. So no philosophers are interested in strange topics. But then you can also have the particular affirmative, where you have some SRP. So some philosophers are interested in strange topics. And then you can have the particular negative, which are some S are not P. So some philosophers are not interested in strange topics. And then from these statements, he has what are called A statements, E statements, I statements, O statements. For our purposes, you don't need to remember all the details of this. I just want to give you a taste of what his approach to logic is. But this is how Aristotle starts to formalize logic into these different types of statements. Well, we can look at these statements and we can see how the subject and the predicate are related to each other. So if we have the statement all A are B, well, A is obviously a subset of B in this case. So we can use what's called an Euler diagram to diagram the relationships. So if this circle represents all the set of A, well, all of the set of A would be in B. But notice what this entails, or at least what this does not entail. So it doesn't follow logically that all B are therefore A, because in this case, if all A are B, there are some B that aren't inside of A. Or we could look at the universal negative. So no A are B. Well, we can represent this, we can diagram this with having an A circle over here and a B circle over here, and you see that there's no overlap between them. So if it's the case that no A is inside a B, then there should be no places where they're touching each other at all, which means that it's logically the same as saying no B are A. And so you can see the relationships between words, and again, these relationships between words are really just things that exist in the material world around us, so you can be doing experiments with this. You just have to fill in the subject and the predicate, and you'll see that if you do an experiment in the real world, this is the same every single time. Then you have the statement, some A are B. Here you see some overlap. So there's some connection between A and B, which means there's at least one element that is both A and B. But note, we can't infer from this that some A are not B, because to say that some A are B could also be this. It could be all of A is B, and it's also the case that some B are not A is just logically equivalent to this. So you can represent some A or B this way, and you can also represent it this way. And so we're just seeing the relationships between the way the words work themselves. Or you have the statement, some A are not B. There's at least some element that is not in A. There's at least one element that is in A, but it's not in B. And so we have this represented in our Euler diagram here. Now, the statement some A are B does not follow. And that's true because you could also represent the statement some A are not B this way, where you have no overlap. And also, the statement some B are not A does not follow because you could represent the Euler diagram this way, and they're all saying basically the same type of thing. same logical relationships between the statements. Now, if you take these basic types of statements, you could construct a syllogism with these statements if you line them up together and if you line them up in the right way. So here I'm going to construct a syllogism using all universal affirmative statements. So we have our all statements all down the line. So all flowers are plants, all roses are flowers. Conclusion, therefore all roses are plants. Now what you want to do in logic is you want to figure out whether or not this construction is logically valid. So you can take away the subject and the predicate here, and you could just have use letters to represent each of these. So you could have all M is P, all S is M, conclusion, all S is P. Is this a logical form? Well, again, using our Euler diagram, we can have our M statement here, and if all M is P, then we have to put the all of M inside of P. Then we put all S inside of M, and then we ask the question, is it the case that all of S is inside of P? Well, in this case, yes, all S is inside of P. So this is a logically valid argument. The structure is correct. So to say that something is logically valid is just to say that if the premises are true, then the conclusion logically, deductively follows. Well, let's take another type of statement, and here we're going to be using EAE statements. So an E statement are universal negatives, so no flowers are trees. A statements, all roses are flowers. So the conclusion, therefore, no roses are trees. Well, now is this statement logically valid? Well, we can construct Euler diagrams again to try to figure out if this is the case. So to say that no flowers are trees is just to say that no M is P. So we want to make sure that our M statements and our P statements are separate, or M term, P term separate. And then you have all S is M, so we want to make sure that S is inside of M, and therefore we ask the question, does it follow that therefore no S is P? Well, it does follow logically if no M is inside of P and all S is inside of M. Therefore, this is a logically valid syllogism. Let's look at one more just for the fun of it. So here we have all A statements, all M are, or all mammals are animals, all cats are animals, therefore all cats are mammals. Now, is this a valid argument? Well, you have to be careful when you're looking at these syllogisms because it might be the case that the conclusion is true, and in fact we have an argument here where all cats are in fact mammals. But if we're asking, is this a valid argument, we're not necessarily concerned about whether or not the conclusion is true. What we're concerned with is it the case that the conclusion logically follows from the premises? And in this case, if we use an Euler diagram again, we can have the M statement, all M is P, so we want to put all M inside of P, and then we have another A statement, all M is S, or all S is P, so we want to put all S inside of P, and in this case, I'm just going to put S inside of P, but it's not going to be inside of M, because that's something that you can do, and that shows that there would be an exception to the case. So if we ask the question, is the conclusion valid, or is this argument valid, is it the case that all S are inside of M? Well, we see the case that S is not inside of M, therefore this syllogism is not valid. It's an incorrect syllogism, even though the conclusion is true. Now we can show that this is invalid by just changing our terms. So instead of talking about mammals, let's just talk about dogs. So here it's easy to see how the syllogism's not valid. So if we say all dogs are animals, okay, I'll accept that as true. All cats are animals, oh yeah, I'll accept that as true too. Well, does it follow that therefore all cats are dogs? Well, no, obviously it doesn't follow. It's invalid. And so this structure is logically invalid. And this really is what Aristotle is formalizing in his approach to logic. And again, I just want to emphasize that when Aristotle's doing this, he's not trying to do logic in the abstract. He's trying to use logic as a tool for understanding the world that we observe around us. And the way that he does that is he wants to attach words. And so definitions of words really matter for Aristotle, such as the word tree. If you can't give a precise definition of what a tree is, and if you can't match that definition of a word to the object itself, then logic becomes useless. You might be able to understand the relationship between words and how they relate to each other and understand the grammar, but if you can't attach those words to real objects, then logic is not being used for any purpose. And for him, the main way to use logic is really in the sciences or in natural philosophy for Aristotle. And so that's Aristotle's approach to logic. Again, you don't need to remember all the details. I just wanted to give you a little bit of a taste of what it is that Aristotle formalized when he formalized logic.